Our speaker this evening is John Coss. John is an established and good friend of Dorset Humanists, and this is his second talk for us. He is Vice Chair of Stockport Humanists. So Lynn, you're Vice Chair as well, so Vice Chairs may want to get together later on, discuss what sort of vice you need to be getting involved in. And John is also former Secretary of Greater Manchester Humanists. And he told me yesterday that the idea of God never made any sense to him as a child or as an adult. So one of these rare people perhaps who's never got indoctrinated at all. He only got involved in humanism in retirement as something to do. Was that the gist of it, John?
Well, I joined what was the BHA some time before that, but the only thing I did then was to go to a meeting of the Sea of Faith, where Robert Ashby was then
that's right, yes.
was actually talking.
Yes.
So it got advertised in the newsletter.
John is also a regular columnist for Humanistically Speaking, which is our fabulous humanist magazine, which I hope you're all reading from cover to cover. John's regular column is Humanists in Profile, and his latest one coming out in July is on Mary Wollstonecraft, late 18th century feminist and considered to be a humanist. And John told me, again yesterday, that he went on a pilgrimage this week to the Mary Wollstonecraft pub near St Peter's.
It's the Mary Shelley pub I discovered.
Oh, is it the Mary Shelley? Oh yes, it is the Mary Shelley, yeah. Oh well, related.
They're all in the church opposite, of course.
Yes, or bits of them, yeah, apparently. Every summer, John walks from Swanage to the Sandbanks ferry, but you said that you're maybe not quite so keen on doing that at the moment, but anyway, he is a keen walker, and in his professional life, John was an actuary, which, if you don't know, someone who works out life expectancy for insurance, and he spent quite a few years working in Australia. Now, I don't think John has ever tried any illegal substances, but he's going to talk about it anyway tonight, and his ideas for reforming the current situation. John has said he's probably going to talk for 55 minutes, so I've cut into your time already, John. We will have time for Q&A afterwards, and there's been a request that we don't record the Q&A in case anyone in the audience has taken illegal substances at any point in their time on this planet. So that's just a little safeguard. Okay.
It's not actually illegal to take them unless for something in prison, but it's the possession which is criminal.
Possession.
But
okay.
Nevertheless, people might prefer not to be known.
Prefer not to say anything. Okay. That's enough from me. Please give John a very warm welcome.
Thank you. I'll try and live up to some. Let's turn to the next slide. That's the sort of overview of what I'm planning to do. The first two sections will probably take up more than half the time, because I want to set the scene properly and explore the range of views you get on these issues. Then I will look at what I've been able to find about humanism and controlled drugs, and drawing all that together will suggest some ideas principles which I think humans should follow. I'll have a short look at what a number of other countries are doing, and then discuss briefly the prospects for reform here on these things. We turn to I think I should start by amplifying a little bit some of the comments David just made. As far as I know, I've never encountered any illegal drug except once, and that was when it was an exhibit in a trial and I was on the jury. And so I don't think that counts. But I have suffered secondary smoking, and I've certainly had my fill of alcohol in my early days in particular. I would have been drunk a number of times, I think, not for a very long time, I might add. And I'm sure that when I was in Australia in the early days there, I was driving after drinking in a way which I wouldn't dream of doing now. It's now illegal, but wasn't then. To the best of my knowledge, no one, including myself, ever suffered any long-term harm from those things. But I've known several people who've died from alcohol poisoning, and about 6 who've I think you could reasonably say had died as far as tobacco is concerned. So I tend to sort of take a fairly strong view on alcohol and tobacco. And I think, like a lot of the sources I'm looking at, it seems to me that all of those psychoactive substances we should look at in a consistent sort of way. So just now, if we look at controlled drugs, well, the legal situation is governed by the Misuse of Drugs Act, as amended, and you'll see there's 3 classifications. The penalties are highest for Class A, and there's considerable issues with the classification. For instance, cannabis at one time was Class C, was reduced to Class C for a while, and then back to Class B shortly afterwards. Caused a bit of a fuss, I think, where David Nutt was concerned in particular. You might think that controlled drugs would be classified according to relative harms, and perhaps take account also of the benefits that one might come from them. But I don't think that's really the case, and certainly the experts would disagree on that one. Just say something briefly about legal highs, which were very much in the public domain a few years ago. As you can see, defined as anything which by stimulating or depressing the person's central nervous system affects their mental functioning or emotional state. The alcohol, tobacco and all the other things which were otherwise regulated were not covered by that. But the Psychoactive Substances Act means that they are now no longer legal, they're illegal. It's just that legal highs was the term around at that time. There's much criticism of unintended consequences to that. For instance, I think incense had to be specially exempted from it, as far as the church services goes. And it's interesting, it's the only case where consumption can be a crime, and that's only if you're in prison. So alcohol, there's a long history, of course, of usage and many problems with it. It's the greatest, I think it's fair to say it's the greatest cause of harm to others from all psychoactive substances. And we're talking here about the harm per head of usage. We're not taking account at this stage the fact that alcohol is much more widely used than the others. There are in fact about 3 million deaths a year worldwide from alcohol, compared to about 375,000 from all of the prescribed drugs. And it's especially a leading cause of death amongst young males. There are, of course, restrictions on advertising and sales, things like drink driving and so on, and taxation and price issues, and when you can sell it and who can sell it, how it can be advertised. So that, in a sense, it is fairly strongly regulated, and that seems to me the kind of approach we should be taking to the controlled drugs as well. And if we look at tobacco, which is my particular bit, I suppose, that causes far more harm worldwide than all the others. And secondary smoking is particularly pernicious, it seems to me. There's over 1 million deaths per annum, I think, in the world, which are attributed to secondary smoking. But there has been a very marked decline in usage in this country. You can see at the bottom, in 1948, something like over 80% of men and over 40% of women were smokers. But you can see the steady decline, and it's now down to about 14% for the UK as a whole. And it's particularly low at the older ages. And that is an encouraging sign, because actually it takes a long time for a lot of the effects of tobacco to show up. And I think it's fair to say that if you give up by the age of 30, you avoid nearly all of the extra mortality which is attributed to it. The trouble is, of course, we're still suffering from deaths from smoking, because people who may have stopped smoking 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but they're still having some of the effects of it. So there's still a considerable number of deaths from smoking. But it's interesting that 20 years ago, women on average did 4 or 5 years longer than men, and that difference was significantly affected by the different proportion of smoking. And now smoking is coming down, the difference between men and women is also coming down, and in the long-term projections it's perhaps only 2 years instead of 4 or 5 years. So smoking really does have a big impact. Caffeine is actually the most widely used of these psychoactive drugs. There's a long history of use found in all sorts of drinks. I must say, as far as I'm concerned, it has no effect whatever. My sister is quite keen on the belief that you should drink decaffeinated coffee, and claims that she gets really high if she doesn't. But it doesn't make the slightest bit of difference to me. But I do know that things like some of the soft drinks have got a lot of caffeine in them, and you can get quite high on some of that. And so there have been plans to legislate to limit the sale of some of the high energy drinks in particular. But as far as I know, there's no action being taken on that yet. I just thought I should say something briefly about medical drugs, partly because some of them are psychoactive, for sort of mood disorders and that kind of thing. They are only ever administered under prescription and controlled circumstances by the doctor. But of course there are a lot of other medical drugs which are equally potentially dangerous, and they're available in principle according to the issues around them, either as prescription only or only available from chemists or from any outlets. And even then there are limits on some of them, such as paracetamol. And then there's cannabis medical use. About 3 years ago the government finally legislated to allow cannabis to be used for medical purposes. But when I looked at this a couple of months ago, only 3 prescriptions had then been issued on the National Health Service. The impression is that the medical profession is reluctant to do so, mainly on the grounds that there's no British evidence to support its effectiveness and to indicate what harms it might generate. There is plenty of overseas evidence, of course, that it can be quite beneficial, but so far the medical profession seems reluctant to observe that. Perhaps just make a brief mention of opioids. There was a real epidemic of these in America a few years ago, assisted by the promotional efforts of the chemical companies, the pharmaceutical companies, and it was convenient for the doctors also to prescribe them. And really it was quite, don't remember the actual numbers of deaths, but it really was a major epidemic and concern. So, yes, I think I've already covered medical use of cannabis, so I won't sort of say any more about that. I want to look now at the harms and benefits from these drugs, the perceived harms to users, and the harms to the community, and the benefits, and also the consequences of illicit drugs policy. The current situation itself generates a number of harms for people. So here's one presentation on the harms to the user of various psychoactive drugs, and you'll see that the orange ones include tobacco, and alcohol is on there?
Just below.
Yes, and they are above all those yellow ones, but most of which are controlled drugs. And it seems inconsistent to have that kind of pattern. And as you see, heroin, which comes out as the most severe, dangerous one, followed by cocaine. And while different people have somewhat different ratings of these things, that's the sort of pattern, I think, which everyone sort of comes up with. So now look at some work done by David Nutt. And this is from a report which he produced about 10 years ago, where a rather complicated process. They determined a whole range of harms to the user, subdivided according to physical and sorry, let me read this. Harms to the user and harms to others at the bottom. There's a whole range of them which they've sort of explored, and then they came up with some ideas about the relative harms of various sort of drugs, including alcohol and tobacco. And you'll see that alcohol is way up at the top, followed by heroin, then crack cocaine, if I can pronounce it properly, methamphetamine, then cocaine, then tobacco, and then it tails off down below. And one of the ideas that I've come across is the idea from David Nutt that there should be 3 classifications. You remember I had A, B and C before. That the top ones should be those which are more dangerous than alcohol, and the bottom ones should be those which are less dangerous than tobacco. And then there'd be an intermediate level between those two. That would produce a rather different sort of classification to the one which we have at the moment.
John, can you just say who David Nutt is? I'm not sure that I may have missed it. But
David Nutt, no, I don't think I have said, he's one of the leading experts, I think, in this field. There's an excellent, David gave a mention to Humanistically Speaking. Well, in the April issue, there's an interview with David Nutt, which is well worth listening to. And he's quite prominent in the field. There is one group I'm going to mention later on, which he's currently involved with. But he, on the whole, he struck me as having sensible views very much about these things.
And the government sacked him because he was so sensible, didn't they?
Well, there was a big fuss about ecstasy at one time, and he pointed out that there were more deaths from horse riding than there were from taking ecstasy at that time. I don't think that went down too well. Also, he criticised that it was a time when they reclassified cannabis from C to B and then back again. And he criticised that. He had a run-in with Johnson. No, well, not with David Cameron, it was with the Labour government. The Home Secretary, Johnson at the time. What was his first name? Alan Johnson. He had a bit of a run-in with him, which meant he got a bit of a notoriety, I think. I don't think David particularly worried about that. It was good publicity, probably. But yes, that's him, all right. So there's also, of course, harms from criminalisation. Now, this is interesting. I came across this. It's a submission to the Health and Social Care Committee looking at the consequences of drugs policy, which I'm going to look at later on. And this guy Gleeson is a qualified practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine in Ireland, I think. What actually entitled him to have a view on this, I'm not quite sure, but I thought the views he did express were quite interesting. So I've sort of put them out for you. That I think a lot of these make sense when you think about them. That you're not sure what you're consuming. You often have to put yourself in some danger to get it, regarding where you go and who you meet. Many illicit drugs are more enticing simply because they are illicit. You often put money in the hands of criminal gangs involved in other far more destructive activities. There's increased difficulty in accessing the potential benefits of many of these substances. The necessity for lies, secrecy and deception. I think a big major one, the reluctance to report adverse reactions and overdose, sometimes with fatal consequences. And of course the provision of legal pretext for the incarceration and exploitation of the otherwise inoffensive. That's a big matter in America in particular, I think. And it sort of creates criminals, which is not really a sensible thing to do. It also promotes the development of ever new, untested, often dangerous substances. And it promotes resentment towards and distrust of the forces of the law. So that's quite an interesting analysis of some of the harms from the actual process of controlling itself. And then, of course, there are benefits from these things. I'm not claiming I know what they are correctly, but I found this source, which I thought was quite. I've got that in my. That depends on whether they're depressants, stimulants, and hallucinogens that you get that sort of effects. But clearly, some people enjoy all of those. And I might have mentioned in relation to tobacco, which I said is my particular bête noire, that there are people. You've probably heard of David Hockney. He's very much in favour of smoking. Clearly, he gets the enjoyment out of it. And that doesn't seem to be any good reason why people who do get enjoyment from things should be deprived of it just because of what their particular fancy is. The next thing I'd like to look at is the definitions, because we're going to talk about some of these things. And decriminalisation is the removal of criminal penalties for possession of small amounts of specific drugs for personal use. And it can be done in a number of ways. We've had de facto decriminalisation from time to time and in place to place in this country, just because the police prefer not to sort of take any action about things. It also, the amounts that qualify and who and the circumstances in which you get it, you can all have a host of little differences in those things which all slightly affect how it operates. And incidentally, it's permitted under the international regulations, which I'm going to come to in a minute. Legalisation ends the prohibition of a substance and allows production, availability and use to be legally regulated. And again, that can be applied just to one substance, such as cannabis, not necessarily to everything else. And regulation is how the government authorities intervene in the market to control price and potency, packaging, etc., and aspects of production, transport, transit, availability, marketing and use. And again, there's a whole host of different ways of doing that. But I think the important thing to grasp is that nearly everyone who's in favour of legalisation is also very much in favour of regulation. You can differ about what the regulations might be, but there's very few people, I think, who are advocating legalisation and selling these things as if they were sweets and things like that.
So, John, sorry to interrupt, but I mean, are you saying that decriminalisation and legalisation are just two parts of the same kind of process, really?
They're legally different. In particular, I'm going to come to the war on drugs and the various international conventions. And I'm no expert on these, but my understanding is that decriminalisation is permitted under these, legalisation is not, which raises the mystery of how those places which are legalising cannabis in Canada and everything in Oregon are actually doing it. I think they may be breaking international conventions, but our government doesn't seem too worried about that in some respects, so perhaps they're not worried on that sort of thing either. There is technically a difference between them, and there's quite extensive literature going into all of them, which I don't think...
So if I'm slightly confused, is that okay, about the difference between them? Well, I mean, if there's sort of a subtle difference between them almost.
Let's put it this way, legalisation, you could, subject to regulations, you can produce it yourself, or you can buy it from people. Decriminalisation only removes the penalties for small amounts of possession. Possession is different from supply and production. And decriminalisation only applies to possession, and usually only small amounts for personal use.
Okay.
And of course there can be differences of just how much qualifies. But legalisation removes the whole of that paraphernalia, providing you don't break the regulations.
So legalisation is more radical, really?
It's more radical, more extensive.
Right.
But it also means if it comes with regulation, I mean a typical regulation would be an age limit on when you can buy the stuff. And there'd be limits on how it can be sold and marketed and advertised and so on.
Can I also say decriminalisation is not necessarily the removal of penalties. It could be just a reduction of the penalties.
It could possibly be.
It's a less of a crime.
It removes the criminal penalties. Doesn't mean that there aren't any sanctions. I mean, I'll look briefly at Portugal later on, which has decriminalised things, but it doesn't mean that you're free. The social services can get involved and you can be required to do various things when you're discovered to having taken these things. So decriminalisation is a halfway house. It's also permissible under these international rules and regulations. So it's probably at the first step in many cases. But I don't think it goes far enough, certainly. So we come to the war on drugs now. The origins of this were in the US, as so many things are. At the end of prohibition of alcohol, my understanding is that the people involved in trying to administer the prohibition were looking for something to do after prohibition of alcohol came to an end. So they thought drugs might be something which they should get involved with. And then at the time when Nixon was seeking re-election, I think he saw this as a way of diverting attention from some of his other activities. So that led to these international conventions, which there's three of them, and they are supposed to make all of these things illegal. And governments, nearly every government, there's three or four I think which haven't signed up to them, and they're fairly sort of small places. And they are supposed to require governments to sort of control production and disposal and usage. And there's the three which sort of came in at different times. But apart from a few places, the consequences have been failure. There's still drugs in widespread use and production all over the place. And I've got the next slide will offer one explanation of why it will fail. And there are arguments for change, which I'm going to come on to, which I think are gaining increasing support. But these are UN things, so how they get changed is a bit obscure. I don't claim to sort of know how they would go about it. But yes, how to buy drugs. I came across this article by Misha and Callum in the London Review of Books a couple of years ago. They were talking about the ways you can now get these drugs, and really it's a fool's errand to try and prevent a lot of these things happening. You can order things on the dark web. I'd never heard of that before, but apparently that is alive and around. And you can order drugs on that apparently, and they're delivered by the post office a couple of days later. So not much hope for stopping that, I don't think.
It's called the dark post office.
And I've mentioned the policing problems. The problem is there that the police earn less money than they would get by actually organising these drug operators. So the smart people tend to get into providing the drugs rather than stopping it happening. And of course, over the last 10 years or so, there have been increasing limits on the resources available to the police. So that has exacerbated that particular aspect of the problem. So I thought this was an interesting example of how it's futile to try and pursue the present approach. But I should say that I mean by that in our sort of society, because in Japan there is a somewhat different situation at the moment, which I will come to later on. So we now have a look at the range of views, and I've got a number of sources about that, which I probably haven't got time to sort of say more than a few words about each of them. But there's quite a range of them. Nearly all of them will be supportive of change, but there is one I found which really thinks that we should continue with the existing system and actually should apply it properly, and I will sort of say something about them. The Global Commission on Drugs policy is quite an interesting outfit. It's got some pretty high-powered people involved in it, not saying they actually do the work, but people like Kofi Annan, for instance, and George Shultz, who was Reagan's Secretary of State, and a former president of the Treasury, one of the sort of financial boards in America, several presidents, several prime ministers from various countries, mostly South America, South and Central America and Europe, but they include, for instance, Helen Clark, who was the Prime Minister of New Zealand some time ago. I'm afraid the British contingent probably aren't up to the same level insofar as they consist of Nick Clegg and Branson. So we don't really have people at the same sort of level as some of the other places. But I will say a few things about them because they, in particular, they've got a model which I think is the one which we should focus on and follow. Drugwise, I'm afraid there's an error there. I've discovered just today that in fact it's a slightly different outfit which David Nutt set up. But nevertheless, all of those are around, and the LEAP UK is particularly interesting because that's a police group. And also the House of Commons Health and Social Care Committee report. They had a very wide-ranging review in 2019, came up with a lot of what I think are very sensible proposals, and I'll say something about those later on. So the Global Commission on Drugs Policy, you see its purpose is to bring to the international level an informed and science-based discussion about humane and effective ways to reduce the harm caused by drugs and drug control policies to people and societies. And that seems to be a very worthy aim, and they've produced reports every year for about 12 years now, which focus on different aspects of the issue. And really, I think I've been impressed by all the ones that I've read. I can't say I've read them all. And it's, yeah, that's the same thing, isn't it? So the 2011 report pointed out that the global war on drugs had failed, and the consequences were pretty devastating. And they thought fundamental reform was urgently needed. Well, you can say that it's still the case in many places. But there's vast expenditures on criminalisation and repressive measures, but they clearly failed to effectively curtail supply of consumption. And they recommend focus more on public health rather than the criminal sanctions. And government's expenditures should be better spent on other things. And so these were the print recommendations they came up with. To end the criminalisation, marginalisation and stigmatism of people who use drugs but who do no harm to others. To encourage experimentation by governments with models of legal regulation of drugs, especially cannabis. Well, there is a bit of that around, and I think a sensible government here would draw very much on the experience of these different approaches and would use that to inform how they go about it in this country. And that offer health and treatment services to those in need and apply much the same principles and policies to people involved in the lower ends of illegal drug markets, because that's another area where I think it would be sensible to do what they suggest. Of course, you should also try and prevent people taking drugs, but it has to be doing things which are actually likely to work. Just sort of telling people not to do things is probably not going to be very effective. So in particular at the end they say break the taboo on debate and reform. So I think that seems quite a sensible approach, and they've done, as I said, a series of reports looking at different aspects of the problem, which is quite interesting. But this is the thing I want to particularly draw attention to. This came from the 2020 report, I think. They suggest that this is a relationship between harms and how one is dealing with the subject. That complete prohibition has long-term harms at a sort of high level, and unregulated criminal markets. And equally, if you have unregulated ordinary markets, you're going to get all sorts of harms. So the nice place to be is in the middle. Responsible legal regulation is what they advocate, but decriminalisation and harm reduction is getting towards that. But if you start getting too liberal in the regulations, as they call light regulation, so the harms start coming up. And it seems to me that's a nice model, and it's very much in line with how I think the humanists that I've come across think we should approach these things. There's, as I said, there's a number of other groups. Drugwise, they would promote evidence-based information on drugs, alcohol and tobacco, so that they're treating the three together, which I think makes sense. And there's various issues which they've been discussing. There's links to these in the article in Humanistically Speaking, if anyone wants to follow up any of these in detail. Transform is yet another one, and you can see that basically saying the same sort of things as I've just been saying. And then they've got a whole series of publications. There's an enormous amount of work being done in these areas by various people. LEAP UK, this is the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. This is police, undercover operatives, intelligence service, military and a range of figures in the criminal justice system, joining together with civilians to raise awareness to the failed, dangerous and expensive pursuit of a punitive drug policy. So their mission is to reduce the harmful consequences. They advocate evidence-based policies with a public health focus for drugs and mental health. So there's a similarly named group in America, which that's called LEAP rather than LEAP UK. And I think they're even more radical than some of the things they're proposing. But then after all, the problems I think are worse over there as well. And the BMA's got in on the Act a few years ago to see what the role of medical professionals should be. And again, their focus was on preventing and reducing harms and policies for control and encouraging debate and dialogue between the medical profession and policymakers. Not sure how much effect that has actually had, but it does show the sort of thinking of that particular group. And then Harm Reduction International is a leading NGO dedicated to reducing negative health, social and legal impacts of drug use and drug policy. They promote the rights of people who use drugs, which I think is something we should look at, and their communities, to help achieve a world where drug policies and laws contribute to healthier, safer societies. So another worthy aim, and they've got principles of harm reduction, which I quite like. Respecting the rights of people who use drugs, a commitment to evidence, would be a surprise to some politicians, I think. A commitment to social justice and collaborating with networks of people who use drugs, and the avoidance of stigma. Probably not going to achieve all of that, but they seem to me to be principles which we could take note of. And the goals of harm reduction, again, partly the harms to the people users, partly the harms arising from drug laws and policy. And they offer alternatives to current approaches, grounded in the recognition that many people throughout the world are unable or unwilling to stop using illicit drugs. So I think that's being realistic. And drug science, this is the group founded by David Nutt, which I mentioned earlier. His aim is to bring together leading experts and ranges of specialists to carry out research into drug harms and effects. We saw an example of that some slides earlier with this. So evidence-based information on drugs based on latest pharmacological research. So that again seems a sensible scientific approach which they're advocating and developing. And I think their website also has got some references to some of the conclusions they've reached. And then there's the National Drug Prevention Alliance, which again is very impressive in the far as it's extensive. But this one is the group I was mentioning earlier, which is actually against legalisation or decriminalisation. They seek to reduce consumption of drugs, including alcohol and tobacco, in fairness, so as the best way to reduce harms, and strongly oppose legalisation of controlled drugs. But I can find no response from them to the Global Commission reports. So my impression is that these people have an axe to grind, and they're not really sort of that concerned with evidence.
Do you have, sorry, can I just ask, do you have any information on who funds them?
No, I don't. No, I can't answer that one. I don't recall anything on the website about that.
It's always interesting.
Yes, they do provide a sort of advice service to people, I think mainly addressed to sort of parents who've got children taking drugs and that kind of thing. So they are a bit, but it's a little while since I looked at that website. My recollection is that in March, April, they hadn't been very active for some time. But this is a comment. This is their attitude from their website. That they claim that people want drugs to be legal because it suits their lifestyle. Well, that's certainly not why I want them to be legal. While people who argue in their support believe they're protecting a freedom for the use, that's the pinpoint is one of their own technical terms for particular points when they're sort of offering advice to people. They're all about making things easier for the misuser, while the rest of us in society as a whole are ignored. Their arguments are, to be blunt, self-servicing or selfish. Well, I mean, I think that sort of puts them beyond the pale as far as I'm concerned, because all the sources I've mentioned before, and certainly myself, that's not the sort of attitude we're talking about these things at all. But nevertheless, there is this body, and I thought we should have something about them to show that that sort of attitude does exist. And finally, the Health and Social Care Committee, they had a review on drugs policy and reported in October 2019. And they are very much advocating radical change to basically to switch from a criminal approach to a health approach. And I think we've got, and they're worried about this situation we're in because they thought it was getting worse, and there was clear evidence that what we were doing at the moment was not actually working. So what they recommend is a health focus and harm reduction approach rather than using the criminal law. And that, I think, is very much in line with all the other sources except that one, which I mentioned earlier. And certainly I think is in accord with my own thinking. And incidentally, the government didn't take any notice of this as far as I can make it out. And so they're looking for evidence-based, all the right sort of words they're using. And they do point out some differences, some shortcomings in what actually is happening at the moment. And in fairness to the government, they are claiming that they're going to do something about that, which I'll come to later when we talk about the Carol Black report, which was earlier this year. I don't think we've got time to go into this. They had a lot. Yes, they had a lot of written submissions. Nearly all were expressing considerable support for the line which the committee was taking. And only 5 opposed decriminalisation and/or legalisation. That, I remember rightly, included 3 of the crime commissioners in various parts of the country. But several of the others were in the 42 who were supportive of the changes they were suggesting. And there were quite a lot of useful suggestions on matters of detail. It's really quite a well worked out and well presented support. It's a pity that the government hasn't taken any real notice of it as far as I can tell. So this was their. This was from the Drugs, Alcohol and Justice Cross-Party Parliamentary Group. Bit of a mouthful. And there are several parliamentary groups which are active in this field, and this was one which made a submission. And they certainly were committed to evidence-based projects, and they had a lot of detailed outcomes which they were advocating, which I thought were really quite worthwhile, but it's too much detail to get into at this stage. So we now look at the sort of attitudes to drugs that come, and I put drugs in quotes because the controlled drugs are not the only drugs that we're looking at. So as far as I'm concerned, tobacco and alcohol are also drugs, but it is the controlled drugs which we are mostly dealing with here. So you can identify the prohibition extreme where you should try and stamp it out, to the libertarian extreme where basically anything goes. And then there's the middle, what I'd call sensible, and hopefully the humanist cause. So I'm a bit biased perhaps on that. But prohibition, these are some of the things which come up, that drugs are evil, so controlling them is a moral issue. Drug users, junkies, parasites. And if the war on drugs has failed, this hadn't been fought sufficiently. Peter Hitchens is of that view basically, but I'm not sure I take too much notice of his views. And I think you could say that some of the people who've taken this view are almost theological in the way they approach it, and as I said, often based on terrible personal experiences. The classic one being, my daughter died from taking ecstasy. And I've no doubt there are terrible circumstances, and one might think that if we'd been tougher on the prescriptions, that people wouldn't have had access to them. But I'm afraid my view is that you've got to look at these things in the round, in a statistical sense, and good cases, I think, make bad law. So, but anyway, that is there is a view on that line, and one has to take note of it, I think. Then there's a libertarian approach, mostly in America, I think, and probably coming from there's a libertarian party over there who think that we should be allowed to do what we want, subject to perhaps to Mill's harm principle, that you don't harm other people, but you can do what you like to yourself. But the war on drugs is ineffective, I think, which they're probably right about. and it should be ended. Well, I can agree with them on that. But they also say drugs should be freely available and commercial promotion is okay. And I think all the people who advocate change would be dead against both of those conclusions. So I think we have to reject that attitude as well. And then we get the, what you might call the sensible course, the evidence-based policy, focus on harm reduction to everyone, and treat drugs primarily as a health issue, and respect the human rights of drug users, and end the criminalisation and marginalisation and stigmatisation of people who use drugs but do no harm to others, with a long-term aim, I think, of legislation with regulation for particular drugs commensurate with the harms from their use. That seems to me the rational approach, drawing on all the sources we've been looking at. It also seems to me essentially humanist in how humanists should approach it. So my conclusions then from this survey is that the current approach has failed. We can and must do better. We should switch the aim from reducing uses to reducing harms. And we're concerned with the users, society, and for that matter producers, because some of them had a tough time too, which one thinks of what goes on in Afghanistan, for instance. And based policy on evidence, including overseas evidence, which people here are often reluctant to do. Again, I think that is consistent with humanist principles. And so, to go into a bit more detail, be guided by statistical data, not individual cases. Treat drugs primarily as a health issue, respect human rights, adopt consistency of treatment of different drugs for either classification and relation to alcohol and tobacco. So the best approach, I think, is to legalise with appropriate regulation. But decriminalisation may well be a sensible first step for pragmatic reasons. It's more likely to be achievable. And you start with cannabis because that's the most commonly used one, and where the case is far easier to make, I think, for cannabis than for some of the others. We now look at humanism and controlled drugs, public positions that I've been able to find, and then ending up with a humanist approach, which is where I'm sort of heading for. And there's very little in the English and American literature that I've been able to find about references to controlled drugs. In fact, Casper Melville, in an editorial in the New Humanist magazine, and this chap Brett Atto in the Humanist magazine, which is a US publication, they are the only ones I've actually found in a trawl through the internet. Someone here earlier was mentioning that there'd been some action in Europe on drugs. I hadn't come across that, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't been there, of course, and it's something I'll have a look at after this session. But in the all-party parliamentary humanist group, Crispin Blunt is or was the chair, and Jeff Smith was one of the vice chairs. They're also involved in the parliamentary group for drug policy reform, and I'm going to say something about what they say in that capacity. And finally, I've looked at what is on the Humanist UK website, which has any relationship to controlled drugs. One might say not much, but it is better than nothing, perhaps. So Casper Melville, commenting on the removal of the legal obligation to have scientists on the Advisory Council for the Misuse of Drugs. This is just one of a number of hot-button issues, abortion, euthanasia, stem cell research spring to mind, where much as our leaders pay lip service to rationality and evidence-based argument, there was a thicket of myth, dogma and anxiety obscuring a clear view. Well, I think there's some merit, strength in that criticism even today. I'm fairly sure there's nothing else on the New Humanist magazine about drugs, because you can sort of search the index of all the articles they've had, but I've done. And then Brett Atto, I've quoted here a small part of his article, which I think makes a great deal of sense, and certainly represents very much my own sort of view. That part of the philosophy of humanism is to stand against outdated codes of morality that persecute and make life difficult for people. Just as LGBT issues are humanist issues, so too are drug and alcohol issues. When evaluating how society treats inebriants, science and reason should be the standards by which we create policy, not ancient religious texts. Most comparative policy studies agree that drug and alcohol abuse should be regarded as a public health issue, as opposed to a criminal justice issue, and the public funds are best spent on drug treatment and prevention, rather than enforcement and incarceration. He's writing, of course, in America, where incarceration is big business. Vast numbers of people in prison there are a result of drug offences, and it has all sorts of pernicious effects, like sort of restricted access to finance to support education. So it seems to be the case that once someone has been found over there, found guilty of actually using a drug, that they try and make their life as difficult and awkward as possible, rather than trying to sort of sort them out and get them back on a decent level. So Christian Blunt and Jeff Smith, so they're on the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Drug Policy Reform, and this is a quote from one of their recent reports. There must be an end to the severe public health and societal harms caused by the global war on drugs, not least in the UK, where drug-related deaths are the highest on record. So this, I think it can be said to be a humanist view as well. And then Humanist UK, this is the only thing I could find on their website, which the section on public ethical issues. They say one of their aims is to promote humanist views on public ethical issues. We focus on those issues that are either important to humanists in particular, or have high social importance, especially where others are actively promoting views opposed to humanist values, or the humanist voice is excluded or weak. Now, the only thing I found which any of their campaigns which relates to it is an attack on complementary medicine, like homeopathy, that kind of thing. There's nothing whatever that I can see on drugs issues at any time that they've been doing, which I think is a pity, and perhaps something they should be reconsidering. I know they have limits on how much they can do, but I think the complete silence is not really very satisfactory. So let me go to the second one. So these are the sort of principles that I came up with after looking through all of the stuff that we've been looking at so far, trying to bring it together in a way which one can put forward as a humanist approach. That we should adopt a consistent approach to the regulation of all psychoactive substances. And we should recognise that there are benefits as well as harms from their use. We should focus on harm reduction to users and to society, and including harms from regulation. And that means treating drug use primarily as a health issue rather than a matter for the law, respecting the human rights of drug users, provide science-based advice on the risks of drug use and how to avoid and minimise them, something which can be difficult at the moment, but would certainly help, I think, to reduce some of the unpleasant consequences. And advocate legalisation as the long-term aim, with regulation for particular drugs commensurate with the harms from their use. Deregulation may be a useful first step, and starting with cannabis probably makes sense for practical reasons. And I think we could do a bit to help develop an informed public understanding of the issues. So that's my suggestion for how humanists should approach things, and it does seem to me that it would not be unreasonable to ask that Humanist UK should sort of adopt something along those lines. Turning now to what other countries are doing, I will look at a few. I've included Japan at the end as one where their approach is quite different to all of the European and South American countries, and I think that's it's taking account of the different kind of society they live in. And I'll talk about something like that at the end. So that's a map of the EU, as it was, I think, and that was happening. No, it's not entirely the EU, because Turkey is in there as well, I see. And that's showing how most countries really, it's possible. We're talking about the possibility of incarceration. It doesn't, of course, mean to say that it actually happens. But there are countries in red and yellow which have taken a different line on that. Let me just check my text. The blue means you can be incarcerated for any minor drug possession. Orange is not for minor cannabis possession, and red not for minor drug possession of all types. So you see there's actually more red than there is yellow. So Europe is actually sort of changing a bit to a different extent in different places. Uruguay is interesting because they legalised recreational cannabis as far back as 2013, and it's now widely used, and they've legalised. There's regulation on how much you can grow and how much you can use and where you can get it from and all that sort of thing. But clearly they're taking a proactive attitude and in a sense allowing people to sort of take up cannabis more or less as much as they practically likely to need to. I want to, I think. Then we have the Netherlands, which you may have heard about their famous coffee shops. They're not actually legal, but they're sort of permitted. And there's restrictions, they can't advertise, and there's limits on the ages, and you can't buy drugs at them. They tolerate things under strict terms and conditions, especially related to cannabis. And the drug policy still aims to reduce the demand for drugs, the supply and the risks to drug users. But as I said, the coffee shops are a practical way of relating it to the real world. Portugal is in some ways the most extreme case until we come to Oregon years ago, insofar as they decriminalised the personal possession of all drugs in 2001. But it's still an administrative violation. It doesn't mean you can do what there aren't consequences if you're discovered. But the penalties are fines or community service or requirements to sort of have sort of health care and that kind of thing. It's complemented by allocating great resources across the drugs field to prevention, treatment, harm reduction and social integration programs. And an important point people make when discussing Portugal is how it's not sufficient just to decriminalise. You've got to have these ancillary aspects as well, so that you provide resources which help in treatment and harm reduction. And unless you have that as well, then it's unlikely that the decriminalisation will be worthwhile. And one of the questions people sometimes ask is, if you do decriminalise, does usage go up? Well, there's some evidence as far as cannabis is concerned that, in fact, since 2001, the usage did in fact go up in Portugal a bit. But actually it went up even more in Spain, which is a very similar society but didn't have the same sort of rules. So you can actually argue that the decriminalisation helped to restrain the increase rather than causing it. But what the truth of that is, well, I'm not sure. The US, the federal law means that possession and use of all controlled drugs is illegal. But they have difficulties in enforcing that because they can only do it if they have the funds to support the efforts. And I think it's fair to say that Congress has refused to actually allocate funds for this purpose. So they're a bit stymied. And one is left with what happens in the states. Well, there's a whole range of different things in different states. But the trend is for cannabis to be decriminalised or legal. But I think it's now the case, certainly for medical use in nearly all states, and the vast majority, I think this slide may even be out of date when it says 31 states and Washington DC. But there's significant variation in regulation between the states. Some of them are almost libertarian and others are quite restrictive. So in a sense there's a sort of real world sort of example of how judging the effects of different kinds of regulation in fairly similar sort of societies. Though I realise that there's big differences from state to state over there. And I mentioned earlier the opioid epidemic, which is again something to guard against very much. But Oregon has gone as far as anyone, and they decriminalised the possession of all drugs in 2020. It was a result of a ballot measure, so it had public support. And interesting, I wasn't able to produce it as a slide, but I found an advert which the state government has produced, which is sort of explaining what the do's and don'ts of cannabis usage. So you can use it. You can't sell it. You can't take it interstate, for instance, and there's limits in where you can buy it from. So this seems quite an interesting thing to sort of keep an eye on to see how they're going on with it. And then we come to Canada, which allowed medical cannabis to be legal a long time ago, and then in 2018 they passed the Cannabis Act, which created a legal and regulatory framework for controlling production, distribution, sale and possession of cannabis in Canada. And this is done on a provincial basis. So again, different provinces are doing different things, but there are there's a great number of regulations attaching to it. Some of them going into quite an amount of detail. For instance, there's rules in the armed services for when and when not you can actually use cannabis. If you're about to go on active service for something, you can't. I don't remember all the details, but it was quite detailed as to the circumstances in which members of the armed forces were allowed to use cannabis and when they weren't. And there are rules like where cannabis can be sold, it has to be a certain distance away from schools, for instance. One of the issues they have there is if they're too restrictive on the legal market, it won't curtail the illegal market, which is what they're trying to do. So there's a sort of balance you have to strike. And another balance is between what you might call the medical approach and the public health approach. Because the medical people might well say we should try and stop people below age 21 from using it because it can be harmful for some people in those ages. But the public health people say, yes, the best way to reduce harm below those ages is to make it legal from about age 18 or 19. But again, different provinces are doing different things there, so it's going to be possible to get some idea of how these different approaches, what works and what is not so effective. And I mentioned Japan because they've taken a quite different approach, a hardline approach to drugs, very severe penalties, and as a result, a very low usage. They reckon only 3% have ever used drugs, which is remarkably low. I think in this country, something like 25% have to use them in a given year. And visitors have to be careful about prescribed medicines. I think our own sort of people give advice to visitors from this country to be careful about medicines. And of course other Asian countries are similarly intolerant. One thinks of Singapore where they apply the death penalty to some people. But I think I would argue that the culture there is quite different. And I think experience here and in America suggests that it just wouldn't work here. That's what we found out. And of course there is an analogy between Muslim countries and alcohol, which they prohibit, and cannabis, which they allow. So I think we can take note of those other cultures, but I think we've got to adopt policies which align with our own. So finally then, what are the prospects for reform? Well, the government position is that they produced this national drug strategy in December last year in response to the Black Review, From Harm to Hope, 10-year drug plan to cut crime and save lives. I think it's fair to say that some of the things they claim they're going to do will be helpful and cut down some of the adverse effects. But unfortunately the Black Review, which was found all sorts of problems and deficiencies in the current approach, but they won't allow by the terms of reference to consider whether we should switch from a legal approach to a health approach. So she just wasn't able to say anything about that. And so the government, obviously that's the position the government will be in, at least for some time. And I would think at least until the next election, whatever happens to the government after that. And so of course the Conservative Party naturally supports the national drug strategy, but they do have a reform group, drug policy reform group, which is, I think, particularly progressive. The chairman is, or was, Crispin Blunt, the parliamentary humanist group, and David Nutt, in fact, is an advisor to them. And if the government was to take their advice, that would be a vast improvement on what's happening at the moment. So there is hope, even within the Conservative Party, that there will be some change at some stage. The Labour Party, in its 2019 election manifesto, committed to develop a public health approach, but I haven't been able to find anything out about its current policy. And I think that applies more widely than just to this particular topic. The Liberal Democrats currently want to introduce a legal and regulated market for cannabis, And I have an idea that they wanted to go a lot further in some earlier manifestos, but that is what was in the last manifesto for the 2019 election. But the Green Party, you would think they were made up of humanists. They want to end the prohibition of drugs and create a system of legal regulation to minimise the harms associated with drug use, reduction and supply as part of an inclusive, supportive and socially just society. Well, I think we can all agree with that. It's a pity that they're unlikely to have a chance to sort of do anything about it. And then public opinion. YouGov did a poll in April 2021, and the results are pretty much the same as the one they did 2 years before that. And when they found that 20% strongly supported legalisation and 32% tended to support, and then the other percentages, 15 and 17%. You can also break that down by age, and not surprisingly, the youngsters are much keener than the elders. They've also broken it down by political affiliation, and again, Labour is strongly in favour, the Liberal Democrats are fairly strongly in favour, and the Conservatives are marginally against. But the trouble with that one is that it's very much age-related as well, I would think. I'm pretty sure the people who support Conservatives are older on average than those who support Labour. So that the age you can't tell whether it's the age or the political affiliation which actually determines that particular issue. And finally, what I would say about what's going to happen in the future, I think the phrase I would use is cautiously optimistic about the prospects for worthwhile change in the medium term. When you look at so-called progress on other issues such as assisted dying, one might well think that it will never happen. It's probably more likely after a change of government, I would think. And I think also that developments in other countries may provide some sort of pressure to do something here. That it often seems to be the case that we wait for lots of other people to do things before we take them on ourselves. And I'm fairly sure that we would sort of go initially for dealing with cannabis and probably decriminalisation. But the thing is, if you've got a change of mood, then you can get quite substantial changes, I think. So I think that's where I sort of come to an end, and that I think is...
Thank you very much, John. There's lots for us to think about and discuss there. I'm not sure whether I should give you this, though. It's a psychoactive substance. It's red and it's liquid.
I'll take a chance.
Okay, thank you very much.